April 16th, 1945, 4:02 in the morning. The air is cold enough to see your breath, thick with the smell of pine, damp earth, and something else, something metallic and acrid, fear. We are just west of the Seelow Heights, the last major defensive line before Berlin. The ground here is a churned mess of soil and shattered trees, a grim overture to the symphony of destruction that is about to begin. For 16-year-old Private Günter Hess, this is the edge of the world. The unit he belongs to is a ghost of a company, a hastily assembled collection of old men from the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, and boys from the Hitlerjugend, boys like Günter. They are armed with antiquated rifles, a handful of Panzerfausts, and a fanatical belief in the Führer. They are Germany's last hope, which is to say, they are no hope at all. Below them, shrouded in the pre-dawn fog rolling off the Oder River, lies the first Belarusian front of the Soviet Red Army. Nearly 1 million men, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, and thousands of tanks are coiled like a serpent, ready to strike at the heart of the Reich. The orders, screamed down the line from a grizzled, one-armed sergeant just an hour before, were simple, absolute, and suicidal. No retreat, not one step back, victory or death. For every meter of German soil, a Russian body. Any man who falters, who even thinks of surrender, will be shot on the spot as a traitor. This is the Führer's command. It was not a strategic directive. It was a death sentence, signed by an unseen hand in a bunker miles away. The prohibition was not merely against retreat, but against the very idea of survival. To be captured was a greater sin than to die. In his trembling hands, Günter clutches his Carabiner 98T rifle. It is heavy, the wood worn smooth by a soldier who used it before him, a soldier who is likely already dead. But his eyes are fixed on something else, a small white piece of cloth tucked into his bread bag. It was a handkerchief his mother had given him, a simple, useless civilian object. It had no place on a battlefield. It was a token of a life he was supposed to have left behind, a life of peace, of home. In the insane calculus of this final, desperate battle, this simple piece of linen had become a forbidden tool. It was not a weapon for killing, but a symbol of surrender, an idea more dangerous than any Soviet tank. And as the earth began to tremble, as the sky to the east began to flash with the light of 1,000 guns, a quiet, defiant thought bloomed in Günter's mind. It was a thought that went against years of indoctrination, against the screams of his officers, against the very foundation of his world. He looked at the terrified faces of the other boys around him, boys who were about to be erased from existence for a cause already lost, and he made a decision, a monumental gamble. He would not fire his rifle. He would not die for a lie. He would hold on to that small white handkerchief, and when the moment came, he would commit the ultimate act of treason that would either see him shot by his own side, killed by the enemy, or, just maybe, grant him the one thing no one else on this hill was being offered, a future. To understand the choice Günter Hess would make, you must first understand the boy he was meant to be. Born in 1929 in a small town in Pomerania, Günter was not a product of Germany, he was a product of the Nazi Party. He was a child of the regime. His earliest memories were not of fairy tales, but of torchlight parades. His lullabies with the songs of the Reich. His school was not just a place of learning, it was an incubator for ideology. Günter was a model student, not of mathematics or literature, but of doctrine. He excelled in the Reichskuratorium for Jugendertüchtigung, the state-sponsored program for youth fitness. He could recite passages from Mein Kampf the way other children could recite poetry. He believed, with the unshakable faith of a child, in the narrative he was given, in the purity of the Aryan race, the injustice of the Versailles Treaty, and the divine providence of Adolf Hitler. His mind was a fortress, built brick by brick with the propaganda of the state. He was not taught to think, he was taught to believe. And his greatest passion, nurtured from the age of 10 in the Deutsches Jungvolk, was cartography. He loved maps. He loved the clean, precise lines, the logic of topography, the way the chaotic world could be organized onto a single sheet of paper. He saw the world not as a collection of people, but as a series of strategic points, of territories to be conquered and controlled. He was being trained to see the world as a map of his own destiny, a destiny intertwined with the glorious thousand-year Reich. Now, zoom out from that classroom to the strategic nightmare of April 1945. The war is over. Everyone knows it, even if they dare not speak it. The grand map that Günter once studied with such reverence is now a tethered ruin. Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944 had shattered the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. The Vistula-Oder offensive in January of 1945 had brought the Red Army to the doorstep of the Reich. The man orchestrating the Soviet assault is Marshal Zhukov, a commander known for his brutal, methodical, and overwhelming application of force. His objective is not to defeat Germany, but to annihilate it. His armies, like the 8th Guards Army and the 1st Guards Tank Army, are not just military formations. They are instruments of vengeance, hardened by years of the most savage warfare in human history. They are coming for Berlin, and the Seelow Heights is the last door to kick down.
Günter is no longer a boy with a map. He is a pin on someone else's. He is part of a Kampf group, a battle group, thrown together and attached to the German 9th Army. His squad is a tragic microcosm of the collapsing Reich. There is Sergeant Kessel, the one-armed veteran of Stalingrad, a man whose silence is more terrifying than any speech. There is Klaus, 15 years old, whose hands are so small he can barely grip his rifle. There is Helmut, also 15, who still has the soft, round face of a child and who weeps silently in the dark. And there is Günter, the cartographer, the believer, who clutches his rifle and tries to reconcile the glorious maps of his youth with the terrifying, fog-shrouded valley before him. The situation is deteriorating by the minute. The field telephone, their only link to headquarters, is dead. A runner sent back an hour ago has not returned. Through the fog, they begin to hear it. Not the rumble of artillery, but something new. The clank of tank treads. The guttural shouts of Russian commands. A single panicked voice crackles over a nearby radio set before being cut off mid-sentence. "They are everywhere! They are—" The official plan, the grand strategy of holding the heights, has already failed. Time is not running out, it has run out. The map has lied. The clean lines and logical topography have dissolved into a chaotic, indefensible patch of mud and shattered trees. And for the first time in his life, Günter Hess begins to suspect that the fortress of his mind has been built on a foundation of sand. The mission is no longer victory. The mission is to die. And Günter, the boy who loved the certainty of maps, is utterly and completely lost. At precisely 5 a.m. local time, Marshal Zhukov gave the order. More than 40,000 artillery pieces, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously. It was the most intense artillery bombardment the world had ever seen. The ground did not just shake, it bucked and heaved like a living thing. The air became a solid wall of sound and pressure, punctuated by the shrieks of incoming rockets. Trees, stripped bare in an instant, became flying splinters. The very geology of the hills was being rewritten by high explosives. For the boys and old men of Günter's unit, it was the end of the world. Men vanished in flashes of light, eardrums burst. The psychological impact was absolute. This was not war. It was an industrial process of extermination. In the midst of this cataclysm, as Günter huddled in his shallow trench, his face pressed into the cold, vibrating earth, he experienced the intellectual spark that would change everything. It wasn't a tactical observation. It was a moment of profound, terrifying clarity. He looked over at Sergeant Kessel, the hardened veteran of Stalingrad, a man whose silence is more terrifying than any speech. His one remaining hand gripped his rifle with white-knuckled intensity. Kessel was not preparing to fight. He was preparing to die. He was a man who had accepted his own annihilation. Then Günter looked at Klaus and Helmut. They were curled into fetal positions, sobbing uncontrollably, their minds shattered by the sheer sensory violence of the barrage. They were not soldiers. They were terrified children waiting for the slaughter. And in that moment, he saw it. The critical detail everyone else had missed, because it wasn't on the battlefield. It was inside their heads. The years of indoctrination, the promise of a glorious death for the Führer, the entire ideological structure, it had all been a lie. The promise was not of glory, but of this, of being turned into vapor and red mist by an invisible enemy for a cause that was already ashes. The aha moment was the realization that the only sane, logical, and strategic move left was the one that was most forbidden. The only way to win was to refuse to play the game. The bombardment lasted for 30 minutes. When it stopped, an unnatural silence fell, broken only by the crackling of fires and the groans of the wounded. And then a new sound. The roar of tank engines and the screams of the Red Army's infantry charge, the iconic Ura battle cry. Through the smoke and lingering dust, the first waves of Soviet T-34 tanks appeared, their long barrels seeming to sniff the air. They were not attacking in a neat formation that could be studied on a map. They were a flood, a tide of steel and men pouring over the landscape. This was the moment of execution. Sergeant Kessel stood up, raised his rifle, and was immediately cut down by a burst of machine gun fire from an advancing tank. Helmut, jolted into action by raw panic, tried to fire a Panzerfaust, only to be hit by the same spray of bullets. Klaus remained frozen, weeping. Günter watched it all happen in the space of a few seconds. He saw the utter futility of it, and he acted. He did not raise his rifle. He did not charge. He dropped his Karabiner 98K into the mud. He reached into his bread bag and pulled out the small, white handkerchief. His hands shaking, he tied it to the end of a broken tree branch. It was a pathetic, tiny flag of defiance against the storm. Then he stood up.
From the Soviet perspective, it was a moment of bizarre confusion. The Red Army soldiers, men who had fought their way from Stalingrad, were accustomed to fanatical resistance, especially from Hitler Youth units. They expected every position to be defended to the last bullet, to the last man. They were prepared for ambushes, for last-ditch suicide attacks. What they were not prepared for was this: a lone, uniformed boy, standing calmly amidst the carnage, holding a makeshift white flag. For a few critical seconds, the soldiers in that sector hesitated. Was it a trap? A trick? For the common soldier, the man looking at Günter through his rifle sights, it was a moment of human recognition. He wasn't seeing a fanatic of the 12th SS. He was seeing a child, a boy who looked no older than his own son or younger brother back in Russia. This hesitation, this brief pause in the machinery of war, was the key to Günter's success. He had not used a weapon of steel, but a weapon of psychology. He had gambled not on wind direction or terrain, but on the shred of humanity that might still exist in his enemy. He took a tentative step forward, his hands raised. He saw Klaus, still huddled in the trench, look up at him with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Günter shouted, his voice cracking, "Klaus, it's over! Don't shoot!" He began walking slowly, deliberately, down the hill towards the Soviet lines. He was a ghost walking away from his own grave. The Great Escape was not a mad dash through smoke and fire. It was a slow, deliberate march away from insanity. The tide of the battle did not turn. Günter simply stepped out of its path. Later, captured German officers further down the line would be interrogated about the collapse of this sector. They would speak of the devastating artillery, of a sudden, inexplicable crumbling of morale. No one reported a great battle. The line had just dissolved. In the chaos and the fog of war, the simple, profound act of one boy throwing down his weapon was misinterpreted as the collapse of an entire defensive pocket. The first validation of Günter's decision came not in words, but in an action. As he was swarmed by Red Army soldiers and pushed to the ground, he saw another soldier approach Klaus, who had finally, shakily, stood up with his hands in the air. A large, weathered Soviet sergeant looked from Günter to Klaus, then back again. He could have shot the boy. Instead, he simply gestured with his rifle, a sharp, upward motion. Get moving. In the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front, this was an act of profound mercy. It was the first ripple of Günter's choice. By saving himself, he had saved another. The reckoning, however, was not to be with a German superior officer, but with a Soviet one. He was taken to a makeshift command post in a captured farmhouse. The interrogator was a captain from the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. This was the tense debriefing, and the stakes were not a career, but life itself. Through a translator, the captain's questions were sharp, precise. What is your unit? What was its strength? But then the captain leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. You are Hitler, youth. You were taught to fight to the death. Why did you surrender? In his worldview, a true fascist would never surrender. Therefore, Günter's act was suspicious. It did not compute. Günter's defense was not a plea. It was not an excuse. It was a simple, irrefutable statement of battlefield necessity, translated into stark, plain Russian. He looked the NKVD captain in the eye and said, I saw the artillery. I saw the tanks. I saw my sergeant die. There was no victory, only death. I did not want to die for nothing. The captain stared at Günter for a long, silent moment. He was searching for the lie, for the hidden motive. But all he saw was a tired, terrified, and profoundly disillusioned 16-year-old boy. The irrefutable logic was not in the words themselves, but in the truth of the experience that lay behind them. It was a logic the captain, a veteran of this bloody war, understood perfectly. There was no grudging vindication in the form of praise, but there was a nod, a curt, almost imperceptible gesture to the guards. The interrogation was over. Günter was not taken out and shot. He was simply classified as what he was, a child soldier, captured in battle. His humble reward came a week later as he was being processed. He was handed a small, rough-spun bread roll and a tin cup of hot, weak soup. It was not a medal, it was not a commendation, but for a boy who had been marching towards certain death just days before, it was everything. It was the taste and feel of life. It was a reward given not for his courage in fighting, but for his courage in refusing to fight. The most profound ripple effects of a single choice are often the ones that are never seen. There was no military doctrine rewritten because of what Günter Hess did. His act was too small, too personal, to ever be recorded in an after-action report. But the doctrine that was changed was his own. The entire belief system upon which his life had been built was dismantled in a single morning. The ultimate proof of his genius was not that he taught an army how to fight, but that he taught himself how to live. Decades later, the archives would yield small validations of moments just like his. A diary entry from a Soviet infantryman reads, "We expected fanatics at the Seelow Heights. We found children. I saw one, no older than my Nikolai, simply walk towards us with his hands up. It was a strange and pathetic sight. We are told they are monsters, but they are just boys, sent to die by monsters." Günter's post-war life was quiet and unassuming. He spent 2 years in a Soviet POW camp. He returned to a divided Germany in 1947, a gaunt, somber young man who had left as a boy. He never spoke of the war.
He went back to his childhood passion, maps. He became a city planner, a man who spent his life not conquering territory, but organizing it for civilians, for families, for peace. He dedicated his career to creating logical, orderly spaces for people to live, a quiet, lifelong effort to impose the sense and reason on the world that had been so savagely absent on that hill in 1945. The final confession comes from a letter. It was written in 1985 to his own grandson, on the boy's 16th birthday, the age Günter was, when he went to war. The letter was found after his death, tucked away in a small wooden box with his mother's handkerchief. He wrote, "My dearest Thomas, today you are 16. When I was your age, my future was meant to last only a few more hours. I was in a place called the Seelow Heights, and I was told that my duty as a man was to die for my country. I was given a rifle and told that courage was measured in the number of enemies you killed before you were killed. But that morning I learned the most important lesson of my life. I realized the true courage is not about dying for a flag. It is about having the strength to see the truth, even when the whole world is screaming a lie. The battle taught me something no map, no teacher, no leader ever could, that your life is your own. It does not belong to any ideology, to any politician, to any cause that asks you to throw it away for nothing. The most difficult and most important decision you will ever make is the one that allows you to keep living, to be good, and to build something better than what came before you. My choice was not to fight. My choice was you, Thomas. It was for the son I would have and the grandson you would become. That was the only victory worth having." And maybe that's the real lesson of Günter Hess, that the bravest act is not always to stand and fight, but sometimes it is to see the insanity for what it is and to be the first to lay down your arms. The story of Günter Hess is one of millions that often go untold, lost in the shadows of great battles and famous generals. If you believe these personal histories are crucial to understanding the true cost of war, please consider subscribing to W2 Explained and joining our community on Patreon. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these vital stories. And please share in the comments below what other unsung figures or moments from the war deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching.